I'll admit it, I can be a little selfish sometimes. The majority of people are probably excited for Xenoblade X Definitive Edition just because it means more people can play it for the first time, such as people who never owned a Wii U or people who got into the Xenoblade series with the Switch offerings. But I, on the other hand, am more excited about the fact that this is more or less soft confirmation that I am going to get to play some kind of Xenoblade Chronicles X2 during the generation of the Switch successor. People really started anticipating some sort of Xenoblade X follow-up after Future Redeemed came out as DLC for Xenoblade 3 because of potential story connections to the rest of the series. I, on the other hand, was concerned that we'd never see X again because from a gameplay and exploration perspective, Xenoblade 3 and especially Future Redeemed are closer to X than any previous numbered games. I was thinking that they were just putting as many unused gameplay concepts for additional X content or an X2 into Xenoblade 3 so it didn't go to waste, and while we'd maybe see some more stuff like that in Xenoblade 4 and onwards, and we just never get a truly open world Xenoblade game again. The thing is, X potentially tying closer into the main series on a story level doesn't mean anything for a new X game. Generally speaking, bringing the canon of a spin-off into the canon of the main series is the domain of an entry in the main series, not the spin-off. So, while X could have always continued from a story point without a proper sequel, I would always still be mourning the loss of the style of game that X is. X is by far the most unique game in the series, and there really is nothing quite like it out there in any genre. While the Xenoblade series as a whole is fairly unique as far as Japanese RPGs go, if you like Xenoblade 1 and want to play something like it, you can just play Xenoblade 2 and 3. If you like X and want to play something like it, you can either play one of the Xenoblade games and get 0% of the open world experience, play Final Fantasy XV and get 0% of the good gameplay experience, or play Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and get 0% of the JRPG experience. All of that, though, is no longer a concern, because Future Redeemed's world design and exploration were clearly not some last gasp of unused Xenoblade X ideas. They were a prototype for either a new area in Xenoblade X Definitive Edition, or even more exciting, a brand new world for Xenoblade X2. Now, of course, the idea of X2 being a thing has existed more or less since people finished X1 for the first time and realized it left so many things unanswered from a story perspective, but I think it really picked up, especially after the Xenoblade 2 patch cycle ended, and people were beginning to think that the series would begin alternating between numbered games and X games. The problem with that is, while Xenoblade 2 is connected to Xenoblade 1 in a very fundamental way, from a story perspective, you can play either of them first and largely get the same experience. Though, of course, I would always recommend playing in release order whenever possible. Unless they wanted to really annoy fans and just never follow up on any of those unanswered questions from the original X, there's no real way that X2 could be the same style of sequel to X1 that Xenoblade 2 is to Xenoblade 1. It would need to be a direct story sequel. This means that everyone asking for an X2 to be made on the Switch were kind of misguided, because there's no reasonable way to make an X2 without porting X1 to the Switch beforehand, so the much larger install base could actually experience the original game and necessary parts of the original story. All that goes to say, just like how I think you can't have a Xenoblade 4 without remastering Xenosaga first, you cannot have a Xenoblade X2 without remastering Xenoblade X1 first. And now, we're getting a remaster of Xenoblade X1 that has new story content, and seeing as how the 5 seconds we've been shown are a follow-up to a scene that had unanswered questions in it from the original game, and aren't just Shulk and Rex popping out of a Zohar portal to recruit Elma for the multiversal Xenovengers, a full game-size, proper follow-up seems almost inevitable now. While yes, it is basically confirmed that a Xenoblade 4 or something in a new story arc for mainline Xenoblade, whatever it's called, is in development already, Monolith has effectively doubled in size since Xenoblade 2 first came out, so the idea that they have separate teams working on separate full new Xenoblade games with 2 different gameplay styles at the same time is actually possible nowadays. Barring all the extra grindy stuff in Xenoblade 2, X has more content than any individual numbered game, plus its bigger world, different art style, and completely different cast of enemies means it does take more brand new assets and therefore almost certainly more time to make than any of the numbered games. So I don't think the original theories of alternating between numbered and X are ever going to come true, but maybe a ratio of 1 X game for every 2 numbered games is possible. Now that that groundwork is all out of the way, what was the title of this video actually about? Why do I think Xenoblade X2 could be something a little bit more than just a more modernized successor to Xenoblade X1? Well, the first thing is wishful thinking. A Xenoblade X MMO is probably the one kind of game I want to be made more than anything else. And barring other single-player Xeno entries that come out after it, probably the last game I would ever need to buy if it keeps getting decent amounts of content. So, again, I'm selfish, I have personal reasons to believe this might be true. Another reason is that they're not reworking the online component for Xenoblade X Definitive Edition. The game's Nintendo Shop page is already out, and not only does it confirm that 32 players will be supported, not in proper co-op, but in sort of a loose asynchronous thing where you can work together to collect items and defeat certain enemies to get rewards for everyone in the group, but also that the up to 4-player proper multiplayer missions from the original game will also still be present. So none of the online content is being removed from the original X for this remaster, which it wouldn't be quite a definitive edition if they did take that out, so that's a good sign. The second thing is that Xenoblade X's online is one of the most functional online systems a Nintendo game has ever had. Now, I know that's a fairly low bar to clear, and that the majority of the online content that most players would have done was just the asynchronous squad task stuff, but when you did party up with up to 3 other players to take on an online mission or fight a boss, it did work surprisingly well. While there was some rubber banding in that kind of thing, I can't recall there being any horrendous lag like in the Pokemon games or Smash, or as many DCs as even the most recent Splatoon entry, so at the very least, I at least recall X's online being as good as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's, which is another one of the best Nintendo Online experiences. If they're able to recreate that on the Switch just as good as it was on the Wii U, then they can probably do the same thing on a future platform, and since they'll be on more powerful hardware that will presumably have more robust online components, and maybe even some infrastructure improvements like have been rumored for a very long time, there is a chance there could be even more stuff. The second is that way back in the day, I'm talking 2016 to 2017, in between Xenoblade X and Xenoblade 2, a couple somewhat infamous Monolith Soft recruitment drives went out. These are the ones that are primarily associated with this concept art that people were always assuming meant some sort of new IP was in development that would look like that. That's of course not the case. Maybe they are working on a new IP and have been the entire time, but it's not going to look like that. Any concept art they show off in that kind of context, unless it's for a Xenoblade game that already exists, was either never intended to be part of a game they were going to make, or was already rejected from being one, so there's no way they were going to show off their new IP for the first time in concept art in 2017, and then literally never talk about it since then. Anyway though, while we can guess that some of their later recruitment drives likely ended up on the Zelda team because they were talking about action games and the like, these two specifically, the 2016 and 2017 one, were looking for people who had experience with online systems and programming for those. The 2017 one also described this project as ambitious and unlike what Monolith Soft usually makes, and while that also could very easily imply a new IP, a game in a different genre that requires ambition to pull off properly in the IP they already make a lot could also make sense. Now, yes, Monolith does work on the Splatoon and Animal Crossing series, but as far as we know, that's just their support team, which is primarily based around asset creation, and they did not do any programming work. So, on at least 2 occasions since Xenoblade X, the last game we know as a fact Monolith worked on online features for, they've been recruiting people with experience making online features. I know it's been a very long time since then, so there is of course a good chance that whatever project they were working on or intending to work on with those people has been scrapped, but also if we're talking an MMO, those take a really long time to make from the ground up. And then, most recently, are two very big deals. The first thing is the most obvious one, the Nintendo Switch Online playtest program, which is still going on as of the time I'm recording this. Now, there's not really anything that needs to be said additionally to that. They're working to playtest new online systems that presumably are not just going to remain on the original Switch system, and from all the word of mouth I've been exposed to from people who are actually participating in it, the online does work really well, like better than you would expect something from Nintendo to do. So it seems like Nintendo is actually planning on having better online servers and infrastructure for online games on the Switch successor. That being said though, we don't know if Xenoblade X Definitive Edition is going to make use of any of these systems, because it's pretty likely that all the online content is either going to be a direct port of the stuff from the Wii U, or a direct port of the stuff from the Wii U with a few additional fights added, so they wouldn't need to rely on any sort of upgraded infrastructure since they did it fine and it worked fine back in 2015. Now, if since the Wii U online servers went down, they don't have the original hardware they used to run all this stuff, then yeah, probably they should just make use of the newest thing they've got. But the more exciting thing is that better infrastructure for the upcoming hardware would mean a ground-up brand new Xenoblade X game for said new hardware would be able to, from the ground up, from its inception, make use of this stuff and be able to include more robust online features than the original. Remember, in the original Xenoblade X, unless they change it for Definitive Edition, you cannot go adventuring around the world with other players. Only instanced individual fights. Being able to actually explore Mira with your friends would be one of the biggest selling points an X2 could possibly have, and it seems like Nintendo is planning on having the ability to do something like that and have it run well for the first time ever, because we saw what happened in Scarlet and Violet with the upcoming system. Now, unless we engage in completely baseless speculation and say that, oh, maybe Monolith was the developer behind this software used for the playtest. And by the way, the playtest software was almost certainly a prototype made specifically for the playtest in order to stress test the infrastructure. It's nowhere near confirmed that they're ever going to make a full online game based on the contents of that. We can't extrapolate what they're making for this new online service based just on what that was. This only means that Nintendo wants some of their games to have bigger, better, and more robust online features in the future, not necessarily Xenoblade or anything made by Monolith. What does say that Monolith might be doing something like that, though, is the conspicuous absence of a certain important member on the Xenoblade X development team in the credits for any of their recent games. Shigekazu Yamada is an employee of Monolith Soft who joined the company at some point prior to 2011, as his first credit there is on The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword under planning. He's done some other Zelda work as well, as he is credited with associate management on Breath of the Wild and its expansion pass. And besides a special thanks on Future Redeemed, his most recent credit is for Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition, under planning lead, producer, and director of Future Connected. That then leaves one pretty decently sized gap in his resume, which is, what about between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild? Well, for Xenoblade X, he was field level design and lead social system design. He was not the programmer of that. There was a grand total of 1 person credited under network programming and 4 under network support for the game, but it does seem like he was the person in charge of the team designing the online features for the original Xenoblade X, and, well, the last game we know he had a significant role on released in 2020. Obviously, there's a very big chance he's also working on the online systems for XDE, but even if the game's been cooking for that long, which there's a very good chance it has been, I would not be surprised if Monolith has gotten new hires up to speed by having them work on definitive editions before moving on to a full new Xenoblade game. I find it hard to believe that it would take 4 years just to move existing online features over to the Switch and maybe expand on them a little bit. Even if it doesn't end up being Xenoblade, something tells me we are going to see a Monolith game that makes heavier use of online than even X did sometime in the next generation. And there's a decent, though far from certain, chance that it's going to be the first non-remaster Monolith game on the new system. The playtest alone is far from enough to say that Monolith is definitely working on an online game, but that combined with the fact that Monolith does have the capacity to do so, but just haven't for a decade, and the first time in a decade they're doing it, it's just Xenoblade X again, suggests that maybe they are cooking something along those lines. Is any of this confirmation that it's going to be a full MMO with thousands of players on individual servers at a time that can all see and interact with each other, and that you'll be making parties of 12 players all in your skells to take on a new Telethia raid boss that's 6 times the size of the original? No, absolutely not. What it does say is that Xenoblade X2 is inevitable, and Monolith is probably working on a game with more robust online features than the original X had, so it's not unreasonable to guess that those two projects are one and the same. I'd be very surprised if X2 does not let us explore the world in a party of 4 friends all online at the same time, and I could see them also doing something close-ish to what the more recent Monster Hunter games have done with their multiplayer and online lobbies and that sort of thing. And that would honestly make more sense, because if you want your MMO servers to stay up for more than 16 months in current year, you need to catch pretty far up to your WoWs and Final Fantasies and Guild Wars and Elder Scrolls. And the only Nintendo-involved IP that is very ripe for MMO exploitation, and also big enough to easily insert itself with that level of popularity, is Pokemon. So, I don't think it's feasible for there to be a full-size MMO based on Xenoblade X, just because there isn't a big target audience for that, especially for a console-exclusive game. But I'm going to hope and dream and still be very excited for whatever Xenoblade X2 inevitably ends up being. Until next time though, this is Luxon, signing off.